Usually, when I have a guest on the show of this magnitude, we're talking about the sweet science of boxing. We're talking about the rumble in the jungle, the kings of the ring. But my guest today is arguably the most decorated boxing writer alive today. He's the official biographer of Muhammad Ali. He's himself a boxing Hall of Famer, and a man whose words have defined the sport world for decades. Tom Hauser. But today, we're not talking about a fight in a ring. We're talking about the fight against time, against forgiving, and the bond between a mother and a son. Tom has written a powerful memoir titled My Mother and Me. It is a raw, honest, and incredibly tender look at the life of his mother, who, by the way, lived to 96 years old. It's a story about aging, secrets, and the roadmap she left behind for how to live a full life. It's an honor to have him on the show. Tom, how are you? Welcome to the show.
I'm good. Thank you for having me. Nice to be with you.
Good. It's always a pleasure. I mean, I've followed your work for a very long time, and most of the times, I mean, you look at it. We know you from like the Black Lights, the Ali biography. You spent like a lifetime talking about the toughest people in the world. Was it harder for you to write a book about your mother than it was about prize fighting?
Not really. I've written in a lot of different genres. I started off with political writing. I wrote a book called Missing about United States foreign policy and U.S. involvement in the coup in Chile that was made into a feature film starring Jack Lemmon and Sissy Spacek. I've written about moral values and public education, race relations. I've written novels, murder mysteries, spy stories. So this was really just one more attempt at expanding the envelope. And the book, My Mother and Me, was really my last gift to my mother. The reality is that 99.999% of the people who ever live are gone and forgotten 50 or 100 years after their death. Maybe their names on a family tree or photographs in some, in some old family scrapbook album. And I wanted my mother to have this marker about her life. And it was really a remarkable life. The book catalogs the arcs of history and the changes in society that my mother lived through over the course of 96 years. It's about how relationships change over time, and one comes to view a parent as having an identity that's independent of your own and a life apart from your own, not just as your mother or father, although that was always at the core of our relationship. And in some ways, I found the most important part of the book and the part that people are responding to the most is that it's about watching someone you love grow old and then very old until there comes a time when they feel that their life has a sense of completion and they're ready to die. And that's very sad. But my mother lived a long, full life. She was 96 when she died. The last 5 weeks were very hard, but she had a great life up until then. And so I'm very happy I wrote it. She knew I'd be writing it. She said to me, I want you to be honest. And she said, look, the affairs that, you know, Cy was, her husband, the affairs that, that were part of our marriage, and I want you to write about them too. Wouldn't be much of a book if you left the good parts out. Uh, and but she ultimately had a very fulfilling life. She and my father did separate, but late in life he had one of those catastrophic strokes that really just destroyed the good part of his life. The last 9 months of his life, he was severely compromised. And she took care, even though they were separated, she took care of him in a very good, loving way during that period. It's hard for me to describe her in whole. I try to do that in the book. And I also think the book's a fun read. I mean, there are cameo appearances throughout by people ranging from Barbara Streisand to Charles Lindbergh and Muhammad Ali. It was quite a life.
Yeah, and I'm going to get to those, but I want to get back. I want to get back to a couple things because it's a wide variety here. So, firstly, I want to know what was your. Now we know the book's about your mother, but what was your relationship with your father in the meantime as you're writing this book about your mother? What was your relationship with your father prior to the
Well,
separation?
my father died in 1994, I guess it was. That's a long time ago. And so he he wasn't present as an active force in my life after that point in time. My parents were very different people. My mother was very outgoing and open. My father was much more closed. He was a kind man, a gentleman, uh, not very in touch with his emotions or feelings, which was one of the problems in the marriage. Excuse me. When I was 13, he had a bad breakdown. He suffered from severe depression, and for a period of about 8 years, he was largely incapacitated, which was one of the things that shaped my own growing up. And he, uh, he got well. He became functioning and happy again when my mother left my father. And at that point, my mother was in her, let's see, probably mid 60s, and he was slightly older. And there was concern in the family that that might precipitate another crisis for him, but it didn't. He had gotten stronger by that point. And my mother actually, and this is detailed at great length in the book, left my father to resume an affair she had had in high school with her old high
Okay.
school boyfriend who resurfaced in her life. And then uh, Buddy, which was his name, died of lung cancer. And at that point, if my mother had wanted to go back to my father, because they never formally divorced, if my mother wanted to go back to my father, I think he would have taken her back. And if he really wanted her to come back, she probably would have gone. But they both understood that they were happier and better off being friends. And they lived that way from that point on. They lived separately, obviously. They came occasionally to family functions together. They had lunch or dinner from time to time. So
Sure.
it was a very cordial separation in that regard. In terms of my father, as I said, he had one of those horrible catastrophic strokes that in some ways reduced his cognitive abilities to those of a 5-year-old. He had his left arm was largely immobilized. He had trouble speaking, although he could verbalize his thoughts. And there was one evening when I went over to see him for dinner, and this was, I guess, about a month before he died. And he was having trouble speaking that evening. And I played a game with him that I used to play with my niece, Jessica, when she was about 5 years old. Jessica lived in Oregon. I live in New York. So we had a telephone relationship. And we'd play a game over the phone where I'd say to Jessica, I put orange juice on your head. And she'd go, oh no, yuck. I put ice cream on your head. And I'd go, oh yuck, there's ice cream all over my head. Oh, okay. I took a napkin and wiped it off. And we'd go back and forth putting whatever we wanted on each other's heads. And I explained the game to my father, and he said, I put orange juice on your head. And I went, oh no, yuck, there's orange juice over my head, and wiped it off. Now, this is a man who at this point is 75 years old. And then he put spinach on my head, and we went on, and he roared with laughter. And when I left that evening, I kissed him on the cheek, and he said to me, I love you much. And as I said, I've thought about that night many times since then because it was the only time after my father's stroke that I heard him laugh. And it was also the only time in my life that he told me he loved me, but I always knew he loved me. So, that's a partial portrait of him.
Yeah, and that could be hard for male to male. You know what I mean? The dads don't do that a lot. They don't give that affection per se. And with your dad having gone through depression and what have you, that's probably harder for him as it is.
Yeah, look, there were some very hard times in his life, but the other token, he in some ways lived a very privileged life. He came from, he did not come from money. His father was a butcher. He came from Newark. He was able to get into Columbia College and then Columbia Law School and became a lawyer. He yeah, had a wife, three children,
Mhm.
lived in Larchmont, which is a nice area in Westchester. And so, in many ways, he lived a privileged life, as I have. But no matter who you are, life can be hard, life can be good. There are ups and downs in every life. And one of the remarkable things about my mother's life, bringing us back to her, is how she had soaring highs and some hard falls, but came through it in a remarkable way and really was to bring it back to her, a very special person. She was intellectually curious. She was genuinely interested in other people. If she asked, how are you? She really wanted to know the answer. She could talk for an hour with anybody and relate to them, whether it was, a bus driver or a housekeeper or the CEO of a corporation. She was a real people person. She was intellectually curious. At age 80, she took a course in geopolitics at NYU just because she wanted to expand her mind in that direction. But the core of the book is really the relationship between us and her relationship with other people, family and friends. And I would hope that people who read My Mother and Me or listen to it because Jim Lampley, who is a good friend, very graciously offered to read the audiobook. And so one can now hear Jim Lampley reading My Mother and Me from Amazon, Apple Books. It's on a lot of different platforms. But she uh, she had a wide range of interests and friends. And one of the things that's gratifying to me is all the response I've gotten to this book. On one level, I got an email after it came out from a woman who said that when this is the woman who's emailing me, was in high school, which was, maybe 60 years ago, she had worked Saturdays in a doctor's office doing filing and all. And there was the office administrator was a woman named Ellie Hauser, who was so nice, and she'd always wondered what happened to Ellie Hauser. And reading the book now, she knew. I've gotten letters from people in Kenya and Argentina, all over the world, who have read the book. And when I say letters, I mean emails. But and I said to myself, boy, my mother would get a kick out of this, knowing that there's somebody in Kenya who just read about her life, and it. So she has that marker, and I suppose to a great degree, it's also a marker for me. I originally intended to call the book My Mother, and then I realized that I couldn't write about my mother without writing about myself, which is how the title changed to My Mother and Me, although my mother is in solid caps and me is in lowercase.
Well, you wanted this book to be a marker for your mom. So what wasn't just it wasn't just a name or just a person on your family tree. When you wrote this, and I really there's a part here I want to get into a little bit in a second. When you wrote this, do you feel you helped I guess because we talk about legacy in boxing all the time, and in life in general, what you leave to your kids is a legacy. Do you feel yourself that you secured her legacy the way like you helped secure Ali's with his biography?
Yeah, definitely. As I said, if I mean, when I look at I knew my grandparents on my mother's side and my father's mother. My father's father died before I was born. All the other people on the family tree, their names. I can tell you that they were born in this place and came to the United States in such a year, and this person was a butcher, and that person owned a slaughterhouse, and this person on the other side of the family, imported coffee, and that person was a lawyer. But I don't really know who they are, who they were. And this book really paints a portrait of my mother. So, for what it's worth, anybody who wants to know who she was, there it is. And obviously, for family members and future generations, that's nice to have. But equally important to me is that some of the themes in the book cut across all divides and resonate with anybody. I mean, certainly. I mean, I've had people. I gave a talk at a senior citizens group in New York, and one of the women came up to me afterwards, and she was in her 80s, and she said, "My children, are very good children, and they're loving, but they really don't understand what it is like to get old and what we go through every day." And I gave them your book, and now they understand. I mean, just like, I mean, you reach a certain, I mean, when we're young, we pop out of bed in the morning, and, we're full of vim, pep vigor, whatever you want to call it. You reach a certain age in life where, certainly if you're in your 90s, and Larry Merchant, another great figure
Yeah.
from HBO in the world of sports, said, it's easy to get into your 80s, it's hard getting out of them. And you reach a certain point in life where you wake up tired. And as the day goes on, you get more tired. And by the time evening comes, you're ready to go to bed. Uh, and these if you're in good health, for 90, you're still 90. Changing a light bulb becomes not just a task, but a chore. I mean, forget about standing on a chair or a ladder to change an overhead light, because you really don't want to do that, because, if you fall, forget it. But just you have to take the bulb out of the lamp, walk very slowly to the closet to get another bulb. You bring it back, you put it in. I mean, light bulb pops for most of us, okay, 15, 20 seconds, it's done. At a certain age, it becomes a 15-minute task. That's just part of getting old. Things that you took for granted, just reading, become more difficult. Everything that they say happens to you when you get older, happens when you get older. The only question is when. And look, there are a lot of, fun parts to this book. There are a lot of laughs and a lot of good, feel good moments, but that's part of the theme here, and it's something that we have to face up to. And I saw that there came a point in my mother's life where she would say to me, "I love living. I'm having a wonderful life, but if I go to bed tonight and don't wake up in the morning, don't grieve for me." Uh,
Oof.
and we will all face that at some time. Look, we know there are some wonderful people in sports now, who we know through boxing, who are all well into their 90s. Larry Merchant, Jerry Eisenberg, Don King, Bob Arum. I mean, this is a group of remarkable men, and they can all tell you that it's not easy getting old. It's not for the faint of heart,
Well,
but
let,
it's
let
better
me.
than the alternative.
Oh yeah, but let me ask you. So you're getting this information from your mother.
Right.
Excuse me. You're getting this information from your mother. How does that make you feel when you when you're writing? Just things like, okay, is this what I'm going to have to expect, or did it turn the way you thought about it? Because if it was me, and my feelings are a little different, um, I would feel like, wow, do I really want to get this? Do I want my kids to feel bad for me that I have to do this, or was your mom like, hey, I'm good?
No, no, we never felt bad for her. One of the wonderful things is that she really enjoyed living, and she never felt sorry for herself. She never demanded. She was appreciative for anything that people did for her and was accepting of what they didn't. And she had no complaints. She treasured her memories and the good things that happened to her in her life, and she still enjoyed every day. She liked reading. She liked watching television. There came a point where her world got smaller. She used to love to go to lectures at the 92nd Street Y and other public events. She loved going to theater, and there came a time when it became harder and harder to do those things. But she found other substitutes. So she really, she liked a good hamburger and a good salad. She enjoyed living. But she came to understand, as we all do at some point, that life is finite. None of us live together. What she didn't want was a dreadful endgame like my father had.
Right.
What she, I mean, just she was married to my father, and like I said, and lived with him as husband and wife for 42 years, I guess it was. Then she left my father and reunited with her high school boyfriend, and they lived together for 6 months, and then he got lung cancer.
Oh,
And she stayed with him as his primary caretaker until he died. And at
mhm.
that point, as I said before, she and my father could have reunited, but they were happier as friends. Then my father suffered his stroke and died. And at that point, my mother felt, well, that part of my life is over. She had, you know, that was it. And she was invited to dinner by a woman named Doris Rosenberg, actually, who had gone out with my father a couple of times after my parents separated. And after, excuse me, my father's stroke, Doris invited my father for dinner several times to some small parties, but my father couldn't go on his own. It would have been like sending a 5-year-old out onto the streets of New
Yeah.
York unprotected. So Doris invited my mother to come with my father. And so my mother and Doris became friendly. After my father died, Doris called my mother and said she was having some people over for dinner and to play bridge. And one of them was a man named Alan Raphael, whose wife had died the same time my father died. And my mother thought that, Doris, I should say, thought my mother and Alan might like each other. And as if that part of my mother's life was over, but she went
Mhm.
anyway because she liked Doris and she met Alan. And they had 10 extraordinarily happy years together. My mother said that even though she was maybe 67 when she and Alan met, they were the happiest 10 years of her life. Uh, Alan died very suddenly at age 87 from a heart attack.
Okay.
My mother and Alan, I think they went to a concert at Lincoln Center in the afternoon, had dinner together, watched a movie on television. And when my mother woke up in the morning, Alan was lying in bed beside her. And immediately she knew something was wrong because she always slept later whenever she woke up. He was in the dining room drinking a cup of coffee, reading the New York Times. And she reached over and felt him, and his body was cold. He'd had a massive heart attack. And what she said was, when I go, I'd like to go like Alan. I just don't want the sort of horrible end game that Cy and Bud had. So she
Right.
was very lucky in that regard. She had a very tough 5 weeks at the end. She fell, and
Mm.
that precipitated a whole range of other things. She was 96. Her body just started to wear down. And she was cognitively sound until the end. She was actually angry that she couldn't end her own life, because at
Mm.
that point, after, say, 3 weeks after she fell, it was clear that it was not going to ever get better, that she was never going to have a quality of life where she was not in bed and in pain. And it angered her. The doctor said to her, "Well, that's not your choice." And she said, "Well, it should be. It should be." And that put me, and I talk about this in the book some, that put me in a very difficult situation because I know enough people that I probably could have gotten some pills and given them
Mm.
to her and ended her life. We know that's against the law, and that's a very slippery slope. Do I have that right? Is it the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do? And what I said to my mother is, look, let's give it another month and see if you can get to a point where you have a quality of life where you still enjoy living. And if you can't get there, we'll deal with it. I don't know what I would have done if it had stretched out uh, that long. Fortunately, I didn't have to make that decision. Now in New York, they have just passed legislation allowing for assisted suicide under certain circumstances. And it's a very cumbersome process. And obviously, ending a life is not something that you take cavalierly. But
No.
my own personal view is if somebody is terminally ill with no hope of improvement and has now been consigned to a lifetime of suffering, and they have the cognitive ability to make that decision, then it should be made. That's why people sign healthcare proxies. And my mother had signed a healthcare proxy giving me certain powers, but because she still had all of her cognitive abilities, I was not in a position to make that decision. And
Yep.
also in New York, and I guess every state, a healthcare proxy doesn't allow you to take affirmative steps to end a life. It simply allows you to withhold treatment. For example, if somebody is in a coma or a vegetative state, you don't do invasive surgery, you don't do cardio resuscitation. It's a very gray area. I understand that people of goodwill can come down on different sides of the issue. And I don't want people to think that this whole book is a downer about death and dying, because there's a lot of fun in it. There's really, she had a wonderful youth. There were wonderful times in her life. As I said, people like Barbara Streisand and Muhammad Ali filter in and out of the story. So the book is an upper in many respects, and I hope at the end of the day, a loving portrait that brings other people and their parents or children together.
Well, I'll tell you, selfishly, when Ray had asked me to have you on, I immediately jumped at it because the boxing world, we know Tom Hauser, we know who you are. Then he was telling me about the book, and I did not know you wrote the memoir about your mother. And looking at it, I was going into it. There is a part in there that is actually why one of the reasons why I really had to ask you. I really wanted to get you on to ask you about it because it is very entrenched in my life, and I'm actually coming to this point at some point. So I'm gonna go. Your mother said explicitly that she didn't want you to make her out to be a saint. Okay.
Right.
Obviously, you said about the affairs and all the stuff that had happened there. Now, as a son, when did you know that there was something up, or did you not know?
Well, okay. First, putting it in context, and I talk about this in the book with, and I can go
And that's the
back.
reason why. And that's the reason why
Yeah.
I only brought up what was
Yeah.
out there.
My father was the first person to go outside the marriage. He had an affair, I guess, about 10 years into the marriage. And that was enormously upsetting to my mother because she had been of the belief that you get married and that's it. You were faithful to each other and it's till death do us part. Uh, and I should add, the only time I ever discussed my parents, you know, sex lives with them was when my mother left my father. And I had one conversation with each of them, which is one more conversation with each of them than I probably would have liked. And my mother, subsequent to my father becoming ill, had an affair, and then eventually she left my father when she reunited with Bud. And one of the remarkable things about the whole journey was before my mother died, this was after she fell, but was fully cognizant. And she was in bed and she said to me, there's a folder in the closet in the den on the top shelf. Do you know the one I mean? And I said yes, and she said, "Could you bring it to me?" And I said, "Sure." And she had known I was going to be writing this book. I didn't I didn't want to start writing while she was alive because that would have meant living every day with the shadow of her death over me. But I'd been thinking about it for a long time. So I went and brought back the folder, and she took out a sheath of about 100 letters. And she said to me, "These are the letters that Bud and I wrote to each other when we started seeing each other again." Now we're talking, I guess, about, the 1988 to 1990 in that period, because it took a long time for my mother to leave my father. She was living in Larchmont, which is a suburb of New York City. Bud was living in London at the time. He had moved to Europe and at one point had been a correspondent for the New York Times and Washington Post over there. You didn't have email, and so they wrote to each other very, very often. And so there were 100 letters, and my mother said, "They're yours. Use them in the book. I trust your judgment. Do whatever you think is right with them." So those letters form the spine of the chapter in the book that deals with the relationship between Bud and my mother. In a way, it was a little like, if you remember the book and movie, The Bridges of Madison County, I think it
Yes.
was,
Mhm.
where I guess it's Meryl Streep had an affair with a traveling
Correct.
photographer played by Clint Eastwood.
Mhm.
And after Meryl Streep dies, her children are reading through her diary, and this whole affair unfolds. Where here, I already knew the ending of the story, but now I had all the letters in front of me to tell me in greater detail how it unfolded. And those letters are part of the book.
Okay.
So
So let me ask you, Tom, quickly on this one. So, did you know prior to you finding out your father had the affair first? Then did that make it seem? I'm not gonna say quote unquote okay that when your mom had the relationship, knowing what she'd gone through, because he obviously, you told me he had a depression issue, and there was the affection that women need was not there. Did you look at it differently? And I only say this in a sense of, because in my situation, um, my wife had a multiple transgressions in her life. I don't know if my son finding out or my children finding out would be. I don't. It's a weird thing. Like, I want to know how you felt. seeing that? I know you said that you saw it before, but the actual physical papers and the actual physical her saying that to you, what, obviously you're going to decide it's your mother. I get that. But did you understand why?
Yeah,
You know,
I would say that I felt sad was
okay.
my not that they had had the affairs as much as I felt sad that there had been a certain emptiness in their lives. I try not to be judgmental of other people. Uh, people have people go outside of the marriage for different reasons, and sometimes in my mind it would be justifiable, sometimes it isn't. People do what they do, and I'm not in a position to judge other people in that regard. I think that it's very hard to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. One of the things that it's actually I talk about it in the book was there was a point where my mother felt that she and my father were drifting apart, and she said to him, "Si, do you love me?" And his response was an irritated, "Of course I love you." That's not a woman or a man would want to hear from their partner. You know, I guess the response to that would be, if you're asking that question, let's have a serious conversation about this and where we stand, because these are the good things I feel, and if I haven't communicated that, yeah, that's on me, or maybe there are other issues. Look, they're not the only two people who had problems with communication in their relationship.
Don't we know? Don't we know?
And that you went through this in your marriage, and uh, obviously I'm not in a position to judge, other than I'm sure the blame was not 100% if you were apportioning it. You might have spent
Correct.
a lot of time at work and unintentionally neglected your spouse. Other thing. Again, you know, people do good things, people do bad things, and I've had friends who have gotten divorced, and where I'm friendly with both partners, and the first thing, you know, I usually say to them is, "I'm sorry that you are going through this, because I know that a lot of unhappiness had to precede your getting to this stage."
Yeah. No, no. And again, like you're saying, I see people that are both sides of the fence with us too. We have friends that are that way, and it's hard going through it. But I don't want to make this all bad. I want to turn it into something that I'm
Yeah.
not saying the whole book is about stuff like this, but
Yeah.
let me tell you, in a world where everyone is like terrified of aging, you know,
Yeah.
what was the important issue that your mom taught you about going through this process of aging?
Uh, that you do the best you can with what you have. I'm at an interesting point. I'm at that point in my life now. For the first time in my life now, I'm starting to feel old. I turn 80 later this month. Now, I've always been able to say to myself, 75, 76, 77, middle age. No, 80 is old, no matter how you cut it.
Hmm.
80 is old. I've been very, very fortunate in that I've been healthy all my life, which is a blessing. Do I take care of myself? Yeah. I watch what my weight. I try to exercise. I eat much more sugar than I should, but I had hernia surgery recently, and the surgeon, we were talking about what to expect afterwards, and the surgeon said, "You are in very good shape for your age, but you are your age." And so,
Boy, that
for the first time, I'm starting to feel a shadowing of that. And one of the books I wrote a book about Chernobyl with a doctor named Robert Peter Gale, who was the bone marrow transplant expert who Mikhail Gorbachev brought over to the Soviet Union to treat the firemen who were victims of radiation when they fought the fire at the Chernobyl
Oh, shit.
nuclear facility. And it actually was made into a movie with John Voight and Jason Robards. And Bob said something to me once years ago. He said, we're all in good health until one day we aren't. And right
Mm.
now I'm in good health, but I know that there are compromises. I no longer run for buses because I don't want to trip and fall. You know, we had a big snowstorm in New York not
Oh,
long ago, and
yeah.
there's a lot of ice that's going to melt, and the streets will be slushy and icy. And what I know at my age is I do not try to jump over the puddles. Either I walk through them or I walk around them. You know, you just you become more careful, you're more aware of your limitations. And I'm blessed. I mean, I feel good. You know, I'm healthy, as I say, but you know, I have the foreshadowings of, you know, having watched very closely, having watched my mother grow old and having other friends, you know, and acquaintances, if we're lucky, someday we will grow old. And you make the best of it. And again, I'm fortunate in that I'm told I have all my cognitive abilities. I'm not in pain. There's really nothing I really want to do that I can't do. Uh, so, the end game, knock on wood, is far in the future for me. But I am aware now of becoming old. And the fact that I'm the oldest person in my family now reinforces that point. And when my mother died, and I was her executor, and I was charged with going through her apartment and distributing all of her belongings. And it did cross my mind that, someday somebody will be going through all my belongings like I'm going through hers now. It
Well,
happens.
let me ask you, Tom, about something you said about writing your books and that. What 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 goes through your mind when you say, I want to write the book on that? What event has to happen other than the fact that your mother's? But what gives you that passion towards something that is like, you know what, I really want to know about this. I really want to know about, because some of the books you've written are they're very unique. I mean, obviously the boxing world is crazy, but like the book on Chernobyl, the doctor in Chernobyl, like what made you decide this is the guy that I'll write this book about?
Okay, great question. First, I do fiction and nonfiction. In addition to the Chernobyl book, all the boxing writing, missing, I've written 13 novels. And fiction and nonfiction are very different. With a novel, I will have a kernel of an idea. I mean, to give you an example, years ago, we're probably talking 40 years ago, it was one of my early novels. There were two events that came together really at the same time. One was that there was a very brutal triple murder that took place in a high-rise garage in New York City. You know, one of those garages where there are three or four
Yes,
levels and you drive up and down the ramp.
McKinney. They call him
Uh,
McKinney.
yeah,
McKinney.
there were three technicians. I think it was from either CBS or ABC who were in the garage walking to their trunk, and they saw a man sort of dragging a woman, who was like he was dragging her, although she seemed to be unconscious, and he was sort of dragging her, her feet scraping around along the ground to a car. And the men walked over, as you or I would do, and said, "Can we help?" And the guy pulled out a gun and shot all three of them dead, killed all three of them. It
It's a
was a
true story.
horror. It would killed all three of them.
This is a true story.
This is a true story. This is true. This happened. It turned
Wow.
out that the gunman was somebody, I think his name was Donald Bowers. He was a hitman, and he'd been hired to kill the woman who was an accountant who was going to testify in a criminal case against her boss. He'd been hired to kill her. He was now taking the body to his car. These three guys stumbled upon it and they were shot
Oh,
dead. It was a horror. You could go online and probably Google it and find it. About the same time, there was a woman named Helen Agnes Menkes who I think played the violin for the New York Philharmonic. And they had a rehearsal one afternoon. They took a break, and she didn't come back for the second half of the rehearsal. And a day later, her body was found at the bottom of the ventilation shaft on top
oh,
of the roof. And what had happened, the police determined, was that a stagehand had made a you know, lewd remark to her, sexual remark to her during the break. She had slapped him.
oh
He
boy.
had he had punched her, dragged her up to the roof, and threw her down the ventilation shaft. So these three thoughts are reverberating, or two incidents, I should say, are reverberating through my mind. The three murders and the one murder at the Met. And something just sparked into my head. Well, what would be worth killing three people for? Suppose there was a missing Beethoven conspiracy. I should say, missing Beethoven symphony, and somebody had stumbled upon it. And from that, there evolved a novel called The Beethoven Conspiracy, which is a murder mystery. I had previously written a detective story with a police detective named Richard Marrett in it, who was a secondary character. Now, in the Beethoven Conspiracy, Marrett became the main character. This was his case. And it was a wonderful, wonderful experience for me to write it. One of the reasons I wrote it was that I missed the new infusion of new music in my life. Uh, you ask me anything about music through 1970, and I'm fantastic. I can sing every major hit, from the golden age of rock and roll through the Beatles and Doors and Stones and Motown. When I graduated from law school and left the campus environment, I lost touch with the music. As I said, I missed the infusion of new music in my life. And I said, well, Beethoven has been around for hundreds of years. If I understood his music, maybe I could appreciate it more. So
Mhm.
I began to study Beethoven's life and Beethoven's music so I could write this book. And in essence, I was putting myself in the shoes of this police detective, Richard Marrett, who had to go through this learning process to solve the case. And I retraced Marrett's steps from going down to Lincoln Center at midnight to reenact a triple murder, which is how the book
Jeez.
starts,
Yeah.
to where the bodies of three freelance musicians are found dead in Damrosch Park next to Lincoln Center, and to working with a core group of musicians who some wonderful, wonderful freelance musicians, who either had their own string quartets or played with the New York Philharmonic, who took me through the process, who could explain the music and help me develop characters. So that was a joy. And with a novel, the research is wonderful. Then I start to write. But before I start to write, before committing to the novel, I've lived with this idea for maybe 6 months. So I know I want to live with it. And using that, I've written murder mysteries, spy stories. I've written novels about Mark Twain, uh, Charles Dickens. I just finished writing a Sherlock Holmes novel where writing is Dr. Watson. I've recreated my own Sherlock Holmes story. So that's fiction. And when I'm writing fiction, the actual writing is the most fun because that's when the characters come alive for me and it all plays out in my head. Nonfiction is completely different. Nonfiction, a project will come to me, and either I'll want to do it or not. Muhammad Ali wants me to be his official biographer. Yeah, I'll do that. The first boxing writing I ever wrote came about much more serendipitously. And I had just finished writing the Beethoven Conspiracy, and I wanted to write a sports book. Well, you can't go into Yankee Stadium and talk to the Yankees. You can't go into Madison Square Garden and talk to the Knicks, but you can go into any gym in any city in the world and talk to the fighters who are training there. And so I wrote a book about the sport and business of boxing called The Black Lights, and that was really my entry into boxing. But with a nonfiction book, I'll get the idea, whether it's being Muhammad Ali's biographer, Arnold Palmer's biographer, writing the book about Chernobyl, and either that will appeal to me, and I'll say yes, I'll do it, or it doesn't. Now with the Chernobyl book, that was the only book I did where I can say the initial motivation was money. We were offered a lot of money, Bob Gale and myself, to write that book. Bob was offered a lot of money. He asked if I would be his collaborator on it, and so I began doing it largely for the money, but it turned out to be a wonderful experience. I mean, it was a joy working with Bob and writing that book, and I'm very pleased with it. With nonfiction, first I finish all my research, then I'm ready to write. And that writing isn't as much fun as with a novel, because at that point I say, well, I know all this stuff. And now I've just got to put it all together. And I'm going over terrain that I've already gone through. It's not like yeah, a novel where I can say, okay, I've got an idea. Let's insert this fight or this, that. Everything's already there, and I have to decide what to do with it.
Now you're saying that they come when you're doing the nonfiction, they come to you for the project. Um, do you feel that
Sometimes they come to me,
okay?
sometimes I come to them. In other words, Muhammad Ali approached me, Arnold Palmer, through his representatives, approached me, which was the case with Bob Gale. There are other instances. I wrote a book early on about a New York City cop named Thomas Shea, who shot and killed a 10-year-old black boy.
Ooh.
This was way back in the 1970s. And Shea became the first cop in the United States to be indicted and tried for murder for an act committed in the line of duty in 50 years. In that instance, I sought out the participants because it was something I wanted to write about.
So that would be a passion project. There's only a few or far between as far as passion projects.
Everything I write is a passion project.
I mean, in the sense of there's something that there's a wrong or something you did getting your journalist hat on where I want this because I want to write about it. I want to get the facts out and write the book about it. Was that something you ever did?
Yes, yeah, this was an important story to set the case up. This was 1973, which was a very different world in police procedures and everything else. Shea and his partner, a man named Walter Scott, were an anti-crime patrol in South Jamaica, which is one of the ghetto areas of Queens. So on anti-crime patrol, they were in an unmarked car wearing civilian clothes. They were on I guess it was midnight to 8 a.m. shift. They were driving down the street in their unmarked car when a report came over the police walkie-talkie that they had in the car that two black men had robbed a cab. One of the black men was described as wearing a brown leather jacket and the other a white floppy hat. At that point, a man named Ed Armstead and Clifford Glover were getting up. Armstead, the African American, he was short. He was about 5 feet 6 inches tall, and he worked in a junkyard. His job was to go into the junkyard every day, taken a acetylene torch and cut the, motors and other parts out of cars so they could be resold either for spare parts or scrap. He was bringing his stepson, Clifford Glover, to work with him. It's 6 o'clock in the morning. By horrible coincidence, Armstead is wearing a brown leather jacket and Clifford is wearing a white floppy hat. Everybody agrees that's what the cab robbers wore. Everybody agrees that Armstead and Glover were not the cab robbers.
Mhm.
Shay and Scott are driving down the street. They see these two. Height is relative. Armstead's 5'6", so they don't understand that Clifford, who's only 10 years old, is a child. They see these two figures. They think they're the robbers. They make a U-turn, pull up behind them. Shay gets out of the car. Everything I've told you now, everybody agrees is fact. What happens next is, according to Armstead, Shay says, "Stop right there, you black bastards." Armstead doesn't know they're police. He's just cashed his paycheck. Uh, he has money in his pocket, but he thinks they're going to rob him, so he runs. Now, as a practical matter, Shay was uber proud of being a cop. If I had to guess, I would guess that he said, "Halt, police," which is what he says. He
Mhm.
said. So I'm guessing Shay said, "Halt, police." Armstead looks at this guy, who looks like anything but a cop, thinks he's going to get robbed and runs. Armstead and the boy are running. Shay fires 3 shots, hits the boy in the back, and kills him.
Ugh.
Shay says he got out of the car, says, "Halt, police," which I believe. At that point, Clifford, the boy, says, "Fuck you, you're not taking me," which I don't believe. Uh, Armstead and Clifford start to run. As they are running away, Clifford reaches across his front, pulls out a gun, lifts it up in the air, starts to turn. As he is turning, Shay fires 3 shots in self-defense, hits the boy in the back. As the boy is falling, he flips the gun to his father, who catches it and runs off with it. These are the two competing stories. Everybody agrees what happens next is Shay and Scott radio for backup help. The first police car that comes down the street with the sirens wailing and the red lights flashing, Armstead jumps out of some bushes, flags the cops down, and shouts out, "Help, help, somebody's shooting at my son."
Mhm.
Now, on the basis of this, Armstead is arrested and charged with the attempted murder of 2 policemen. Then, through an extraordinary but totally justified set of circumstances, which I elaborate on at great length in the book. It's called The Trial of Patrolman Thomas Shay, and it's out there on Amazon. The charges against Armstead are dropped, and Shay becomes the first cop, as I said, anywhere in the United States in 50 years for him to be indicted and tried for murder. And this is a book about the shooting and the trial and everything that went with it. And one of the things I'm most pleased of and proudest of in my writing is when the book came out, I got letters of commendation from both the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association and the NAACP. So
Wow.
obviously I took the story and split it down the middle and was fair to everyone involved. I don't think you could have that same, you know, dual commendation today. We have become so polarized as a society
Yeah.
that nobody's willing to look at things and split them down the middle, but that's what I tried to do. And I viewed Shay as a basically decent person who made a horrible mistake, who fired when he shouldn't have, but let's be real about it. If Clifford Glover had been one of the cab robbers and Shea had shot him under the same circumstances, Shea would have gotten the commendation. And there's one more piece to put in the puzzle now. There's lots more pieces, but one more I'll add now. As I said, Shea and Scott had their police walkie-talkies with them. After the shooting, Scott radioed for help on the walkie-talkie. Shea went out, crossed the lot that Glover had run through to flag down the police. Walter Scott walked into the lot and was standing over Clifford Glover. And Scott had forgotten that his walkie-talkie was still on. So you hear this 10-year-old boy who's on the ground moaning, and Walter Scott, who's standing over him, says, "Die, you little fuck." Now, we have echoes of that in some of the video we have just seen and listened to from Minneapolis. So, in some ways, things are still the same. Although I think the New York City police are much better than they once were. And one of the remarkable things was after Shea was indicted, the number of incidents in which New York City police officers fired their guns dropped by 50%, dropped by half the following year, with no increase in police injuries or fatalities. So the message to policemen was you have to be a lot more careful when you fire your gun. And another thing that I came across when I was writing the book, and this was very surprising to me, is, I asked the question and I asked people, do you know how many times the average New York City police officer fires his gun in the line of duty during the course of his career? And I would have said, well, if you're on the force for 20 years, which is when you were eligible to retire, at a very good pension, maybe 3, 4 times. No, the average New York cop then and now never fires his gun in the line of duty. And sometimes they have to. Sometimes you have no choice.
Yeah.
But there are also times when force is unwarranted. And in New York, at least, that was cut down dramatically after the Thomas Shea shooting. So, that's a fairly long answer to how I decide to write a book. What I find writing the book was a fascinating experience for me. I interviewed Shea, his attorney, the prosecutors in the case, the police commissioner, the cops in the precinct, Ad Armstead, Eloise Glover, who was Clifford Glover's mother. One of the wonderful things about writing is that it introduces me to a whole new world. I get to meet new people, have new experiences. I'm writing an article now for The Guardian about the Columbia women's basketball team. I have a casual familiarity with women's basketball. I know who Gino Auriemma is. Obviously, I watched Caitlin Clark set the world ablaze, the basketball world ablaze. I can tell you who Dawn Stanley is. I watch a couple of NCAA tournament games the women play each year, but I've never been to a women's basketball game before. Well, the weekend after this, I'm going up to watch the Columbia women play Princeton and Penn. I had an interview this past week with Megan Griffith, the very, very good Columbia women's basketball coach. So that's introducing me on a new level to a whole new sport. That's a new experience. And I can say to myself, look how lucky I am. I'm 79 years old. I still get to meet these new people, have interesting conversations and new experiences, and they pay me for it. That's wonderful. I'm a very lucky guy.
Well, Tom, a couple things. Number one, you're a fascinating storyteller. Fascinating. The stories that you're telling me, it's almost like I'm there. experiencing it myself, and that bodes a lot for your talent itself. Um, but secondly, I think a lot about how people preserve the voices of the people that they love, and whether it be the mother or son or daughter, God forbid, anything like that. But you did it with ink and paper, you know. And now we're in a different time. If you could have preserved your mom's voice and personality in a different way, so that like her great grandchildren could have met her, quote unquote, would you have wanted that, or is the book the only way you truly could capture her soul for you?
Well, I think about that a lot. Again, that's a very good question because, in a way, I'm a dinosaur. I'm not only am I a print guy, but I'm a long form print guy. I mean, there are people who set out thinking they're going to be the next AJ Liebling in boxing, and they wind up, tweeting, you know, and that's what they do. I don't do social media. I have a Facebook account. I haven't visited it in years. If I was starting over now, I would probably establish much more of a social media presence to have a greater reach. I might look at, making documentaries or doing more video work. What I like about writing is that it allows me to control the process completely. I write what I want. I paint the portrait I want. I put it out there, and I think I do it pretty well. So that's my medium. Uh, I love the idea that 100 years from now, if we haven't blown each other all up, somebody will be going through an attic in Nebraska and find a book I wrote and spend an afternoon with it. I've written two books really that are footnotes to history, the Big Alley biography and also Missing. And so those books and that film will always be there, which will lead other people in the future to say, well, I wonder what else this guy wrote. Here it is. Okay, let me take a look at this. And that's a nice legacy to have. One thing that's very important to me as a writer, excuse me, very often have young boxing writers ask me if I have any tips for them. And I say, yeah, three things. Number one, if there's free food, grab it. Uh, number two, fighters can be some of the smartest, nicest, most courageous, wonderful people in the world. They're all a little nuts. I mean, you have to have a loose screw to be a fighter, to let and ask any fighter and they'll tell you the same thing. I mean,
Yeah.
to let people beat on you on that. And number three may be most important. And I was at the Shakur Stevenson Teofimo Lopez fight
Oh God.
last last
Saturday.
weekend, and yeah, and somebody from he was a high school student came up to me and asked if I had any advice for him because he wrote for the school paper and he was interested in a career in writing. And I said to him, yeah, write every article you write like it's a feature story for the New York Times, because everything you write becomes part of your creative legacy, and everything you write should be a learning experience for you about how to research, how to write, picking up new subject matter. Uh, and everything you write, you should have pride of authorship in. I'll also add two other thoughts. One is, I used to be a lawyer on Wall Street.
I thought you were.
And yeah, I spent
The way you
5 years
speak.
as a litigator at Cravath, Swaine and Moore. And when I was a young associate there, the way it works is your case will have senior associate, junior associate. There's a partner in charge of the case. And I was always a good writer. I wrote, term papers in school. I liked it. My first year out of law school, I clerked for a federal judge who seemed to like, the writing I did for him with draft opinions and the like. And I'd been instructed to write a memo on a certain aspect of this case that involved oligopolistic market structure in the turbine generator industry, which is not as interesting a subject as Alley Fraser 3 in Manila. But I'd written this memo and put it on the desk of the senior associate. And when I came in at 9 o'clock the next morning, the memo was on my desk, and no sentence had been left unchanged. I mean, there were words crossed out, arrows pointing here and there, and everything. And that's the only really good writing lesson I ever got in my life. And what I took from that is you have to challenge every single word you put on paper to make sure it means what you want it to mean and isn't going to be misconstrued by somebody who reads it. You challenge every word. I remember Lonnie Alley once wrote something about Muhammad that somebody had asked her to write for some project, and she gave it to me and asked if I'd take a quick look through and tell her what I thought. And I read through it and I said, okay, Lonnie, let's start here. You say that Muhammad is 1 in a million. No, if Muhammad was 1 in a million, there'd be 350 other people just like him walking around America. He's not 1 in a million. He's unique. So that's the first lesson. Challenge every word you put on paper. And then the second lesson, along with grabbing free food and, taking care in your writing, is I wrote a novel once, a spy story set in the mountains of Nepal. And I got 55 rejections from publishers before I found a publisher for it. And most rejection letters aren't very helpful. It's thank you very much for this. It's a good book, but it's not suited to our needs. Or I love Hauser's writing, but I prefer his nonfiction. Uh, One day I got two rejection letters on the book. One said the book needed more material on Nepalese politics, and the other said the book needed less material on Nepalese politics. This is not helpful. But there was one theme that ran through more than a couple of the rejections, and that was the reader did not like the main character. They couldn't identify with or empathize with him. And I said, how can they not empathize with him? Don't they understand how much he's suffering? And then I realized, no, they don't realize how much he's suffering because you haven't put it on paper. The reader only knows what you put on paper. Now, if I'm writing about Muhammad Ali, yeah, people have a pretty good idea of what Muhammad Ali looked like when he was young and when he got older. If I'm writing a novel, or writing about a largely unknown person, it's not enough to say, yeah, she was a beautiful woman. You have to fill it out a little bit. What color hair did she have? How long was? What was her figure like? You tell me about her face. Now you can leave as much room to the imagination as you want. You can say uh, at one end of the spectrum, you could say she had a slender athletic figure. You can say she was voluptuous at the other end of the spectrum, or you can fudge it and say she had a body that was on a par with the Sistine Chapel, which lets the reader build their own fantasy. But the reader will only know what you put on paper.
Well, you wrote this after your mom had passed.
Correct.
And you said you needed distance. And if right now let's say you could sit down with her or just one last time, like right now, and read her one specific chapter from this book that you've done. Is there one that sticks out?
Again, you ask great questions. It's the arc of her life as a whole. Let's go through the book. First chapter is about her origins and the world she grew up in and her growing up until she gets married to my father. Now, that's the foundation for her story. It's who she was and the foundation for everything that came afterwards. That's very important. You know, you have to have a foundation before you can build a building, but it's not the most interesting chapter in the book. Chapter number two is about her marriage and my growing up, going through, grade school, junior high school, college, law school, going to Cravath. At the same time, my mother is evolving. This is the chapter that is most about me. And it shows my mother, evolving as she did. Uh, that again, that's an important informational chapter. There's some good anecdotal material in it. To me, the book really catches fire in chapter three when Bud comes back into my mother's life. That is a very, very dramatic recounting of that relationship, and also the turmoil that my mother experienced because it was not easy for her to leave my father. She had a lot of strong feelings about the institution of marriage. She had strong positive feelings from my father as a friend, although even at that point, the marriage had become very empty in some ways. There was the fear of leaving a long marriage and the security of that situation to go out into the unknown. And that is a very, very strong chapter from a reader's point of view, from a dramatic point of view. Same is true of my next chapter. Next chapter is devoted to my father. It builds him out more as a person and then catalogs his life after his stroke and how we responded to it. That's very emotional. Chapter five, we then come to Alan Raphael, who really at the end was the love of my mother's life. That's a feel-good chapter. That really is. That's wow. That's my mother and Alan both have everything they ever wanted in their lives but didn't have. Their relationship validated that part of their lives for each of them. Uh, then Alan dies. So now my mother is on her own. We're in chapter six. For most of her, for really for all of her life, she has defined herself in many respects by the men she's with. First my father, then Bud, after that Alan. Now she starts to define herself more by who she is. And she's moving into old age, but it is a very active, vibrant old age. She has a good time. She's enjoying herself. She is contributing to a lot of people's lives in a very meaningful way. Uh, then she gets old. Yeah, we're in chapter seven. Uh, and at the end of chapter seven, she falls. And what becomes, the struggles everybody has in old age. At the end of the chapter, she falls. And now we're in the end game. Chapter eight is the end game, the 5 weeks from when my mother falls to when she dies. And of course, everything changes when something like that happens, and either you're there for somebody you aren't. Chapter nine, the final chapter of the book, is everything after my mother died, from closing up her estate to memories of her to a very upbeat ending, I think. And all the while through the book, there are reflections infused on, everything from young love to old mortality. It's a journey and it really has to be whole. So, what chapter would my mother like the best? Um, Probably the chapter with Alan, because in some ways that was the happiest time of her life. But I think she'd like the whole book. knowing my father, if he's up in heaven reading it, he's probably saying, but I mean, did you really have to say that I had a breakdown? Yeah, I really had to say it. It was part of the story. And, I sometimes have, as I mentioned earlier, I had hernia surgery, and there's a nurses' strike going on in New York, so things were pretty chaotic. I spent 3 hours in the pre-op room,
Oh,
lying on a gurney, which I figured fine, I can either lie here before or lie at home afterwards. But you're lying there, and so at one point I just ran conversations through my head with different people, and yeah, the first person I spoke to was my mother, and I said, I don't really believe, in an afterlife, but if there is one, I hope I see you again someday, but not yet. I'm not ready for it yet. So let me get through this operation. And then the other was, I spoke to my father, and what I said to him was, let's get to know each other better. And that was a very poignant thought for me and really expressed how I felt because he really was a very good, kind, thoughtful, intelligent man. In terms of what my mother would think about the book, once it was written, I did hear her voice in my head saying, thank you. I do think she would have liked it. It was a portrait of her, as she was. And in a strange sort of way, writing the book has kept her alive for me. I don't mean in a maudlin sense, but it's there. She's not just there in memory. Every time I look at the book and the cover of the book, I don't know, I think you probably have the cover and you've seen
I
that
do.
portrait of her as a young woman. She's there, and I'm lucky I had her. I know she's gone. But how many people get to be 76 years old and still have their mother, let alone a mother as good as she is? And there's something in it everybody can relate to. It's funny. One of the things I talk about in the book is my mother loved a good cry. She cried at the end of the second season of Newsroom when Will proposed to Mac. She cried at the end of The Best Years of Our Lives. She cried at the end of My Fair Lady when Eliza Doolittle came back to Henry Higgins. And I got an email from a reader who I didn't know, who told me that he had read the book, and his mother felt the same way about the end scene of My Fair Lady as my mother did. And so one day for Mother's Day, and he was an actor, and so for Mother's Day one year, he sang "I've Grown Accustomed to Her Face" for his mother. And he gave the recording to his mother, and she played it. She looked at him and said, Rex Harrison sang it better than you did. So, everybody has a mother story tale to tell.
They do. Well, Tom, wrapping this up, I want you to speak to my listeners out there. Now, maybe they're combat sports enthusiasts, maybe they're just sports fans, maybe they're business owners, business leaders who might not think to pick up a memoir book about their mother. But tell them why this fight, the fight to understand our parents, our mother, before they're gone. It's one of the most important fights that we face. Tell them
Okay.
why.
Okay. First, let me again say what I said before that Jim Lampley read the audio version of the book, which is available now. It was a very, very gracious thing for him to do. And if there are any Jim Lampley fans out there, he has an unmistakable, totally unique voice, and that's the that's one way to hear the book. You can hear my thoughts in Jim's voice. So that's number one. In terms of why somebody should read the book, I think it's entertaining. It's a good read. Anybody who reads this will learn something about themselves, about their children if they have them, about their parents. I like to think that it's an important book that will change the way people who read it think about their family, the world, and themselves. And also, I will add that anybody who reads it who wants to communicate with me, my email address is out there. I mean, I'll tell it to you now. It's Thomas Hauser Writer, all one word. ThomasHauserWriter, Thomas Hauser Writer at gmail.com. If you read it, that if you want to share thoughts with me, which a lot of people have done, please do. I promise I will write back to you. One of the very gratifying things to me about this book is the number of people who have read it and reached out to me. A few of them who actually knew my mother, who've come up from the distant past. Others don't know me or know my mother, but they identify with what's written here. I really like hearing from readers. One of the nicest things about writing for a living is the realization that on occasion somebody actually reads what I write, and I'm happy to continue that dialogue with anybody who reads My Mother and Me or listens to Jim Lampley's voice reading it.
Well, I got to be honest with you guys. This conversation really hit home with me. I mean, on this show, we spend a lot of times talking about fighters, talking to fighters, talking to business leaders, the training, the discipline, and stuff like that. But what you brought to the show today showed us the bravest thing you could do isn't always just like throwing a punch. Sometimes it's looking at the people we love the most and seeing them for really who they are and preserving their stories before it's too late. And if you are a fan of writing, great writing, or have a parent getting up there in years, you need to read this book. My Mother and Me, Tom Hauser. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks, Tommy.